Morning, everyone. I'm Nick Welham from C-Link Consulting. It's great to be here. Thank you for joining, and thank you to the COO Forum for the opportunity. So we're going to be covering 4 areas today about exit planning. And normally I give this presentation to business owners, and I've reframed it to the COO's perspective. And as a COO, you do an enormous amount in your organization, and sometimes it's really hard to quantify the ROI. And what we're going to try and do is show how important your role is in exit planning and give you a perspective or a lens to illustrate the impact of what you're doing that doesn't generate the ROI on the bottom line. So I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions. How many of you have an owner or are an owner who's thinking of exiting their business or should be thinking about it? So just put a yes or a no in the chat, or a Y or an N. Right. Okay, some yeses, some nos, pretty even spread. Fun to think about. Okay. So next question for you. If the owner of your company told you that they were looking to sell their business in the next 12 to 18 months, let's say, and asked you to prepare and execute a plan, would you be ready or would you panic? So put ready or panic. Okay. Panic and run out. All right, Ariel. Hopefully we can help you with that. Panic early, paleo. Love it. Okay. So as we go through the presentation, it seems like a lot of you are already ready, but hopefully we'll give you some value from the presentation. But as we go through, and if exit planning sounds like a lot of work, I'd like you to consider if this is something you want to do in a compressed time frame and under pressure. How well will it go? What will be the impact on the business? And the other side of it is what will happen if you don't have an exit strategy. It's more than just being prepared. It's generally a lack of clarity around long-term vision. And I see this manifested in companies. There's a lack of focus on driving value for the business. So you see pursuit of short-term goals, very good at crushing rocks, but not making any long-term impact. I've seen companies where the agendas of their meetings mirror the ones that they had 10 years ago. Same problems, different wording. And I'm embarrassed to admit I owned one of those companies before I turned it around. But this all adds up to a less transferable value. So I'd say this, as a COO, you should be thinking about exit planning, even if the owner isn't thinking about it. So today, what if I gave you a process outline to help guide you through the process? So, let's talk first about a couple of reasons about why an owner would want to walk away from a perfectly good business. Some great reasons, there's some life events that trigger it. Then we'll go into what's the process? What's your role as a COO? So I'm going to use the Exit Planning Institute's methodology, and you'll hear me use a couple of acronyms throughout this presentation. So EPI, Exit Planning Institute, and I'm a Certified Exit Planning Advisor, a CEPA. So you'll hear EPI and CEPA a couple of times. So we'll talk about the process, how you can influence and drive value. And what about exit options? I had exited my company back at the end of 2017. I tried to navigate a strategic exit. I failed to do so, and then did an internal share transfer. I consider it a success. But what does make a successful exit? So the Exit Planning Institute did a survey, and they found that 75% of business owners regret selling their business within a year. Now, I said that my exit was a success, but on the 4th of January of 2018, I sat down, I had 4 emails in my inbox, and I'd used to being the center of a 35 location company. And I felt pretty dislocated and disconnected. So as we go through the presentation today, we're going to put up some surveys to help you gauge where you stand in the exit planning readiness. First one, Fiona, would you mind putting up the quiz one or survey one, please? I'll give you guys a couple of seconds to respond. All right. Fiona, do you want to close the poll and show the responses? All right, so it's pretty mixed. Looks like a lot of you have some experience, probably more than 50%. Yep, which is great. All right, let's talk about those triggers. So up on the screen, you can see our old friend Pac-Man. This represents the 80% of the business owner's wealth. The average business owner at 60 has 80% of their wealth tied up in one share, and that's their business. Now, no financial advisor I know would ever advise somebody to do that. So why do they? Well, they feel like they can control the business. They have more influence in there, and they feel comfortable with it. Exit planning also requires diversification, but also a paradigm shift. So you have to get away from, the owner has to get away from the idea that it's an extra child number one, number two. And why is that? Because often they spend more time with their business than they do with their families. But they need to shift to the idea that a business is a wealth generation asset. And sometimes not being in the business or diversifying your investments might be the best thing for their family. People often ask, when's the best time to exit a business? I'm going to say exit time is irrelevant, but there is a caveat, and that's for an exit-ready business. So what's an exit-ready business? Well, it's one where you've gone through, you've de-risked it, it's well run, it's attractive and ready, and we'll talk about all these factors later and how we measure them. And so you become a magnet for other industries and other organizations to look at you, either model you or make you an offer. And the last thing I want to talk about is what's the role of a CEPA, a Certified Exit Planning Advisor. So it's kind of like being a quarterback. Most owners have a CPA, maybe a CFO involved, a financial advisor, a general attorney, maybe they have a trust and estates attorney. They may know of each other, but it's really unlikely that they've actually sat down together with the owner and coalesced around the idea of advancing the owner's interests. And that's what a CEPA does for the owner. So if you can imagine in your businesses, if the owner only spoke to you individually and other people individually, and you didn't talk with each other, how well would your business run? So question about if you know about the owner's advisory team. So Fiona, would you mind putting up quiz 2, please? Okay. And could you share the results? All right. Really key to have a documented exit plan, and we'll talk about why. And as a COO, ideally, you would know about what that plan is and be involved in it. And I'll talk about how that might work out. So let's move on to the triggers that might push somebody into exiting their business. So I'm going to call them the 5 Ds, and we'll go through each one of them. They're all highly disruptive for a business. Things around decision making, even down to who makes the payroll. So the first one is death, preparing for the worst. So if the owner, really needs to let their family, their management team, and the ownership team know what their wishes are. And ideally, they would tell them as a group, but often this happens individually. Why is it better for a group? Well, then everybody gets to discuss it. Everybody has a shared understanding. I've seen instances where there's been leadership fights because either people didn't hear correctly or they willfully misheard what the owner's intent was individually. And it also helps to align the family and also the leadership team. The owner probably has some advisors. You may or may not know of them. Who should the family and the management team talk to for advice? And then there's questions around what happens to loans, covenants, guarantees, are the beneficiaries on the assets and the life insurance correct? And this can all create significant disruption that then travels back into the organization, lowering the focus and impacting the revenue. And then there's a question about what obligations does the business have to the estate for the shares, and that can impact the cash flow. The next of the 5 Ds is disability. And this brings a really tough level of ambiguity about what to do. What level of ill health means that somebody shouldn't be in the business? What's the point when they're not fit to make decisions, when they shouldn't be in the office? And when they're unable to come in, do other people have those essential passwords that allow them to pay the bills or interface with customers? If there's a power of attorney for financial and medical matters, or even, having voting rights on the shares, as a COO, do you know who that is? Or will somebody turn up to your business one day and say, I represent your owner? How do you validate that? There's a question around whether this event might invoke a purchase of the shares, and how will that get paid? We talked about voting of the shares, but there's a cash impact there. And the question is, who's the real owner now? The third one is divorce. Let's pretend it's an amicable one, best case. Who's making all the decisions? The owner could be distracted. There's a significant amount of disruption and time taken around valuing the shares for that divorce. And how will the owner's finances impact the cash needs of the business? You might well find there's less cash around at that point to do the plans and have to change. Fourth one is disagreement. When people enter into a partnership and they go into business, they're hoping for roses and rainbows, but they rarely prepare for a conflict. And sometimes things don't work out. So the owner's probably going to be figuring and considering and looking very carefully at what their interest is, how will it be valued and paid? And you as a COO are going to be trying to focus on minimizing disruption and business impact. And while you can suggest this, honest conversations between the ownership are a key thing here, but things like buy-sell agreements can really help mitigate the impact. And so these are the things, if you're brought in by the CEPA to the leadership team with the advisors, these are things that should be talked about. And the last one is distress. 2020 taught us some painful lessons around business interruptions. I'd say the work you're putting as a COO to mitigate disruption to productivity and product delivery is critical. And we're going to talk about how de-risking adds value and how we quantify that. But it doesn't really have to be a huge event like COVID or tariffs. Good contingency planning for everyday events is critical as well. Now, worst comes to worst, and we're talking liquidation, the owner's going to be looking at what they're personally liable for. And as an officer of the corporation, you might want to also consider what you're signing and putting your name for and what level of personal guarantees you're doing. So, Fiona, would you mind popping up quiz 3, please? Guys, a few more seconds. So this should give you some idea. These are some of the questions I would talk to an owner about. And would you mind putting the results, Fiona, please? My experience is I went through 4 of the 5 of these. It's running a business can be really tough. So it looks like guys are doing well. Your businesses are very functional, which is great. So how do you mitigate a lot of these things? It's decoupling the owner from the business. Guess what? What do they need? They need a great COO, to take care of the core business. I'm going to show you a survey from the Exit Planning Institute of business owners. And how prepared are they? Generally, not well. Couple of key points there. If they don't understand their options to exit, it can well lower their value and satisfaction. What does that mean for you as a COO? It means that they may change their mind often, which means you go through the sale process many times when you're working with different prospective buyers. Not having a transition plan, we touched on this before, can lead to family and company feuds. They don't have any planning at all. I'd say don't do it. It's not fair. If you wish to stick around forever, that's great, but plan for what's going to happen after. It's your legacy. And then no written plan. Why is this important? Well, I think it's key for a successful transfer. As I mentioned, most owners put more time into their business than they do with their family. And they look at it, look at the blood, sweat, and tears. And to sell a business, you have to have something on the other side that you're excited about. Otherwise, the owner might well back out. So it frustrates buyers and it frustrates brokers and agents who sell businesses. And it will probably frustrate you and cause considerable disruption for the company, whereas the owner's flip-flopping around whether they want to sell or not. All right, so let's talk about the exit planning process. So I mentioned the Exit Planning Institute. This is their 3 stages of exit planning. The first one is the discover phase. And we're going to talk about the owner readiness, the business readiness, and the business attractiveness. Things like documented plans and strategy there. This is often when owners get really excited because they start to think about the value of their business. And unfortunately, sometimes you have to tell them that their baby is perhaps not as pretty as they imagined. But we're also discussing with them around integrating with advisors and that family integration strategy. The prepare phase is where you as the COO fit in. How do you drive value in the business? And we're looking at it through the lens of exit planning. Now, the prepare phase is done in 90-day sprints. There's probably nothing that you guys aren't familiar with. The first step of that is de-risking the business and then driving value. So you can then go and harvest. Similarly, at this point, there's 2 tracks. So you're going to have the financial advisor helping with the personal and financial planning, and the COO or maybe an external value driver helping run business improvements. These sprints run 90 days. Usually it gets to about day 180, but then every 90 days after that, the owner is coming to a decision point. Do I keep or sell my business? Well, at that point, if you're going to sell, you need to have considered your options. You need to have driven as much value in as possible. And some of the things we look at in the discover phase is the potential from where you are and where you need to be, and does it cover what the owner needs? So does it make sense to exit, or should we continue harvesting the value? So next thing, readiness and attractiveness of the business. How ready is the owner? Now, the important thing to remember is it's the buyer's perspective that counts. And I'll talk a little bit about owners' inflated expectations later on. So, Fiona, would you mind bringing up quiz 4, please? Okay, I'm going to leave this up. Now, normally I would go through this in detail with the business owner, but for the interest of time, I'm going to pause at the end of each one of these 3 sections and try and average it out. I think it's really important to be honest here and not over-egg it, but don't be too hard on yourself as well. One of the rules generally is that if you want to score a 3 or above, you need to have written documentation. And I would say that if you're doing a 5 or a 6, where you're talking about best in class and working with advisors, 5 or a 6, you probably worked with multiple people to hone what you're doing. So I'm going to talk about owner readiness. And so if you're an owner or a COO, this will depend on what you know. But the owner would need, to have a written personal plan, what's going to happen after in the next chapter, a personal financial plan. They need to define their post-income business needs, and they need a personal tax plan. And they need to know what the knowledge is of the net proceeds, because what counts is what you get for the business after tax. They need to figure out what the transition process is. They need to have an established advisory team and contingency plans. They need to know what the ideal deal structure is for them, and we'll talk about that, options and what fits later. One of the key things is family awareness of the plan and also business awareness. Sometimes owners don't even share their plans with their family. So take a second. I know it's tougher as the COO, but what do you know about and how would you rate yourself? So the next one is the business ready for transition? So we're really talking about intangible capital here, and I'll detail that later. And we'll go in and talk about how you drive intangible capital and how we measure it in terms of business value. But in some respects, we're really talking about, how involved is the owner? How decoupled are they from the business? Are they working 80 hours a week, putting out fires, spinning plates, or are they just phoning it in? The other things are like, does the brand add value? Do you have good company documentation, corporation documents, legal agreements, operating agreements, buy-sell agreements? Do you have strong contracts with your customers? Do you have a lot of employee management issues? What's the turnover? What's the morale? How well do you manage your expenses? Do you have great systems and processes? Things like, do you have a CRM and does everybody use it? How good are your management systems and forecasts? Can you look 12 months out or 3 years? Do you have a scorecard? Do you keep KPIs and really actually use them? So we're talking about the structural, social, human, and customer capital in your organization. So take a second, give yourself a rating for the business readiness. And the last one is attractiveness. It's essentially risk and reward for the buyer. So typically, buyers will look at the years of business operation, and they want, longer is better. They'll look at the management strength, tenure of employees. Generally, longer is better, but there are concerns around buying a business where everybody might retire soon. What about customer loyalty? Do you have a history of profitability? How do you benchmark in the industry? What's your profitability growth forecast? Is it well thought out and defined? What's the market potential? What are the barriers to entry in your industry? So go ahead, rate yourself on there. Give you a few seconds. All right, if you only want to share the results. See some 5s in there, that's awesome. All right. When I work with owners, I generally see 3s and 4s and have to talk them down a little bit from perhaps how they've rated themselves. But it's great to see a wide range of options there. Okay, I'm going to talk about, when we do the discovery phase with owners, we talk about 3 gaps with them. It's the profit gap, the value gap, and the wealth gap. And these are all critical for the owner in their transition. The first gap is the profit gap. And so we're looking about what could your profit be? So benchmarking against other companies. It can be quite tough to do that for private or niche companies, but there are reference services out there I've used. And the second thing is, if you're a buyer, you've got to figure out how much is the profit if somebody else ran it. Let's just say a professional manager. So we're looking to put the add backs in or recast the EBITDA. So how do you do that? Backing out interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. Then we start normalizing things like salaries. Does the owner take a too small a salary? Do they take too big? Do they have family members in the business who maybe draw a salary for perhaps not doing very much? How about rent? Does the owner own the business? Is it too little? Is it a large charge so they can pay off the building? What about bonuses? Do certain people get abnormally large bonuses, or does the owner take a lot of dividends? Discretionary expenses. I think most owners don't really appreciate how much they can get through discretionary expenses. I certainly didn't. But things like cars, right? So if you had a professional manager, would they warrant a company car? Would it be such a nice car? What about insurance policies or even healthcare coverage? Rather than just for the person, it might be for the owner's family. And then one-time charges, those things like consulting, legal, write-offs, and so on. And so at the end of it, what we're trying to do is we're trying to assess what the business profit value is to the buyer and what the business potential. And so when you're looking at the business potential, thinking about benchmarking, this can be tremendously valuable to a COO. I think so. Okay. The next one is the value gap. So what we're really talking about here are intangible assets. So structural, social, customer, and talent capital. I'm going to talk about how you might drive them in a bit. So the intangibles are what drives your multiples. It's not the listed assets on the balance sheet. There are a couple of markers there, and I'll talk about where they come in. But if we go back to our attractiveness and readiness scores that you guys had, and if you can remember them, sorry, I should have told you to keep hold of them. If you averaged them out, what number did you get? And so when I work with owners, we're doing a more detailed list, but this is where we come in. Now, there's 3 markers on there. There is the 45% mark. And generally, I'm going to say that a business roughly probably isn't saleable below 45%. Why is that? Well, it's not that the business has no value, it just has no value to somebody else. It might be too risky for them to take over. It might not have market potential. You know, the market could be contracting. 58% is the median, and anything over 72%, I know you guys had a couple of 5s in there, is a highly saleable business. Now, I'm not pretending that you'll get a 10x multiple for your business, sorry. But it does give you some idea of the range of values. And the fact is that you need a solid business to even be considered for purchase. So if you remember your numbers, see where you fall. Remember, this is not about the value of your business per se, it's the value of your business to somebody else. So I'm going to show you as COOs how you can significantly influence that value. So when we look at the discovery phase, there's always a couple of ways of looking at things, right? So the first one is, you know, we've got our recast EBITDA, we put our add backs back in and maybe adjust it up and down. We scored somewhere around a 3, so there's good room for improvement. So our exit value before tax is 4 million. A couple of options. One, we can drive that intangible capital, so invest in the business. And so we've got a 6x multiple. Now we're up to 6 million. Or we could try and drive profit, so cost cutting. Still got a 4x multiple, but we've changed our EBITDA up to 1.5, 6 million again. Or we can do what I'm going to talk about is driving value. So I'm going to say it's not a choice when you're looking at exit planning between cutting costs or investing. It's a relentless focus on what will drive value. So what does that mean? So we're talking about superseding immediate shareholder interests. So in private companies, it means a focus on the business, not personal interests or needs for the process of selling the business. So you're not focusing on just cost cutting, you're focusing on driving value and cost cutting at the same time. Now, what I've talked about here is a very informal way of valuing business. It's rough. I would say that if you do get a formal valuation, I would suggest having your attorney commission it because I believe it's covered by attorney-client privilege. So the third gap is for the owner, is the wealth gap. So can I afford to retire in the style I want? That tropical island, right? So what would normally happen is that the financial advisor would come along with a Monte Carlo simulation, do a detailed analysis. But today we're just going to use a really rough guide, and that's the rule of 4. And the idea is that you can take out 4% of the principal and live off it without reducing the principal. So here we have Peter and Jane. And their wealth goal is 36 million, which at the rule of 4 means that they're going to have $1.4 million a year to live on. And just as a side note, if you think about it, if using the rule of 4, you need 2.5 million for a goal of 100,000 a year to live on in retirement. The other thing I'll note that owners often forget is those add backs, right? Cars, insurance, healthcare. And, you know, it requires detailed tax planning from the financial advisor. So how do we calculate the wealth gap? So we've got our 0 to 36 million. Well, Peter and Jane are doing well. They've got $10 million in non-business assets. And we're splitting up the business from the non-business assets. So this could be property, could be 401k, something like that. So their wealth gap is $26 million. Okay, so the business has to sell after tax for $26 million to meet this wealth gap. When we look at the profit gap and the value gap and multiply those out, we can see where you are and what the potential is. Can you bridge that gap? If you can't see how you're going to bridge that gap, then it comes down to an uncomfortable conversation with the owner about downgrading their dream or pushing out their timeline. So there's a couple, if it's possible to actually close that eventually. So hopefully that's given you a little insight into what owners are thinking about. So that's the discover phase. As a CPO, I would talk to the owner about the profit gap, the value gap, and the wealth gap. I would engage the family and the leadership team like your good selves, and we'd sit down, we'd develop a strategic plan about how to get the owner to where they need to be, whether it's just figuring out what an attractive and ready business looks like and driving the intangible capital that we'll talk about in a second, and also engaging the advisors that they have and integrating them with the leadership team. So the next phase is the prepare phase. So this is where you as a COO fits in. The first part, the prepare phase, as I said, is to mitigate risk. It's often skipped because it doesn't drive revenue, but it's really important when it comes to a sale. And you can see this coming out into the attractiveness and readiness reports. A lot of the questions I asked was around, have you mitigated risk in some form? And this will come out in that survey, in the discovery phase, but then more importantly, it comes out in the due diligence phase of the sale. So what happens in the prepare phase? Well, you can see we've got the two paths. We've got the personal and financial planning, and that's handled by usually the financial advisor. So getting the owner excited about the next chapter in their life and also financially planning for it. And then you've got the driving the value path. So business improvements. This is COO territory. Mitigating risk, once again, COO territory. So Fiona, would you mind putting up a quiz 4, please? It's quiz 4, the 4 C's. Awesome, thank you. So we're going to do a quiz again. I'm going to run through the 4 types of intangible capital: human, structural, social, and customer capital. Please remember your score at the end of it. So the first one is human capital. So thinking about things, do you have a documented incentive plan to motivate key employees? How well do you retain your top talent? Do you keep your best performers? There's one thing to have an overall turnover rate, but it's the key people that are really important. Do you offer opportunities for your employees to share their ideas for business growth and reward them for it? How effectively is the business going to operate after the current ownership departs? Will the leadership stick around? These are important things that buyers want to know and will affect the value of the business. So we're really talking about human talent, recruiting, motivating, retain, and their evolution. So rate yourself for human capital. The next one is customer capital. Really talking about quality of earnings here. So things like, do you have reoccurring contracts? Do your payment terms cause cash flow issues? Do you know the characteristics of your best customers and grade them and fire unprofitable ones? Do you know who's unprofitable? How concentrated are your customers as a percentage of your revenue? That's a really strong risk factor. Are your customer relationships transferable to a new owner? Is there a personal relationship, and is that how they got them? Decoupled ownership is important there. Do you know your customer acquisition cost? Do you have a strategy for lowering it? Do you have metrics for your sales team? And more importantly, do you hold them accountable? So rate yourself on customer capital. And the next one is structural capital. So we're talking processes, financial acumen, strategy, and your IP. So we're looking here about, are your key processes documented and used universally? I see a lot of companies have fantastic documentation, but what people are actually doing is up for grabs. If a key employee left your organization, would somebody else be able to complete their job function? Maybe not as well, but would they actually know what to do? Questions around is your equipment current and functional? Is your tech secure and updated? And probably most importantly these days, will AI enhance your business or create risk? And if it will create risk, how are you going to mitigate or change that? So rate yourself for structural capital. And the last one is social capital, it's culture. So does your company have core values that differentiate your company? See a lot of companies that use things like teamwork and integrity. I would imagine that most companies would strive for that. So it's not differentiating. Are they operationalized and used within the company? Another key factor is your culture focused around the leader? Is it Because that's not transferable. Do you encourage communication and feedback at all levels and between levels? And lastly, and use your own judgment on this, does your company have a brand or a vibe that attracts your clients and prospective employees? So if you want to rate yourself for social capital, and so look at your scores there and compare them to your business readiness and attractiveness scores. But the scores there really correlate with where you are on the value in the value gap. And sometimes rating yourself honestly can be good because you have more room to grow. I would say, in terms of the intangible capital, what's your plan for each area? So Fiona, would you mind sharing the results, please? All right, got a best-in-class person here. That's fantastic. All right. So here's a little exercise for you guys. We've got two companies, and I want to know which one you guys would buy. So company one and company two. Company one, obviously earning more, but their customers are quite concentrated, not growing as quickly, and there's reliance on the owner. Fiona, would you mind putting up quiz 6? Which would I buy, please? So if you guys pick company one or company two, and then tell me what you think about the cost of acquisition. And if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat anything you guys see in terms of like what made your decision between company one and company two, or why one would be worth more than the other. All right, Fiona, would you mind closing the poll and sharing, please? Okay. So I would go with company two. I think there's some significant issues with company one around recurring revenue and reliance on the owner, especially when 60% of the revenue is 3 customers. Interesting. I would say that there's a good chance that company two would be priced less on straight profit, but the intangibles could drive up the multiple to something similar. Mike, you've been kind enough to stick your neck out, so you pick company two because concentrate 3 clients. Yep, awesome. So you basically you read my notes. Thank you. Okay. So there's also a management succession plan as well, which I like as a buyer. So what are my options for selling a business? So there's 2 types of exits, an internal or an external. So internally, intergenerational transfer, private companies passing to the kids or family. I'll go back to what I said about wealth generation asset, the business being a wealth generation asset. Does it make most sense for the company, for the family, in terms of their value or not? Management buyout, sale to partners could have been caused by the 5 Ds, sales to employees. So probably talking about a share option or maybe an ESOP. The rage right now, most people don't know they've been around since the 70s. And owners love them because they have significant tax advantages and also morale advantages. But they are expensive to form. They often cost over $1 million, and they require a certain number of employees and also a history of profitability. Externally, you can sell to a third company, recapitalization, and say think private equity, whether it's a minority or majority recap, so selling a minority of the shares. Initial public offering, or God forbid, an orderly liquidation. And so picking between them, we're looking at a combination of time frame, value, and control. And I'll talk more about that in a second. Perhaps the biggest question for owners is, what am I going to get? So owners often have two figures in mind: what they think their business is worth, and God forbid, what happens if the worst happens. And these are relative numbers. So I guess the first question is, does anything beat what the owner thinks their business is worth? And surprisingly, yes. So why would a strategic exit command a higher value? Well, they want capabilities, whether it's market access or IP. And they're willing to pay a premium for that control, and they have relevant industry knowledge, and there's limited dependence on the owner because they're trying to absorb the organization. And for the owner, it's great. I mean, they have extensive capital resources, so there's good liquidity for the shareholders, and also a shorter time to exit. So that's an attractive option. And you can see these are the other options we've got there and their relative exit value. So the green ones are internal internal transfers. What does market value mean and how do you calculate it? Well, think of things like discounted cash flows with adjusted risk for the company stage, asset valuations, comps against other companies in the industry. But the question is, can you find a comparable company and how accurate is the comparison? So the real question is, why not just go for a strategic exit? Well, the problems are they're limited in number. There are confidentiality issues. So when you've got somebody who has industry knowledge and they want your processes, you kind of have to give them some insight into what you're doing. There's also legacy issues around the company name and the culture. Owners do worry about their legacy. So things like employee layoffs, integration difficulties, culture shocks. But at the end of the day, how would you get the attention of a strategic acquirer? Well, I would say be a ready and attractive business. If you are running, best in class of things, people will notice, they'll hear about you, and they'll want to acquire you. So, as an owner, how would I decide, what factors influence which one of those I pick? So the first one is that everybody thinks about is what's my company worth? And it's really the value after tax, but careful tax planning can mitigate that. The next one is control. So how much control do I want over the organization? If you've been an owner, it becomes very hard to, going public. Yes, Mike, sorry, I just saw your comment. Going public would be an IPO for the previous slide, sorry. So control. If you're an owner and you've managed your own business and managed your own destiny, it's quite hard to work for somebody else. So, my power has just gone out. I don't know how long. Oh, it's come back. Sorry. Control. So hard to work for somebody else. So you see this in terms of a workout where the owner has to stick around for a year. How do they feel about that? Can they hack it, or is it the worst time of their life and they regret selling? Things like a partial recap. So I think PE, whether it's majority or minority, and even with a minority, the PE involvement can vary. If you're in a portfolio of companies, even though you might be doing brilliantly, but everybody else is doing terribly, they can't afford for you to fail. So you're going to have a significant amount of attention on you, which may well be unwelcome. And the last factor, which I alluded to before, is legacy. How will I be remembered? So if you're the owner of a company in a small town and you sell out with it's wonderful, you had a strategic acquisition. Unfortunately, they've laid off a lot of people. Are you going to be welcome in the diner, right? How are people going to remember you and perceive you? So these are all factors that owners are kind of balancing, considering, and should consider, because getting this balance right means that they feel better about the exit afterwards. And knowing all these can help them set a course, which makes it easier for you as a COO, because they're not flip-flopping about what they want to do. So we've got to that decide gate. We're looking at that gate every 90 days. I would imagine that the owner should be talking with you as a COO, discussing options, talking about what the implications are and the feasibility of what they're considering as an exit. But let's just say that you've gone through this, you've built the business up, you've de-risked it, things are looking good on the intangible capital side, and they've found an option that makes sense. And then they've gone out and found an agent or a broker, and they're going to take the leap. So what's the process for the sale, and what are you doing as a COO in that process? So we discussed earlier about why mitigating risk and driving intangibles drives value, but it also actually impacts the process timeline for sale. So as a COO, you're not only adding a multiplier to the value of the business, but you're determining how quickly it can be done. The whole exit planning process on average takes about 3.5 years. And the actual bit from when you decide to pull the trigger on a sale can often take a year or more. So, oh, I have a question there. Okay, all right, great to see you.
Nick,
Trickiest
it's
part
a
is,
question above me. I'm sorry to cut you off, but Mike posted a question above my exit.
going public would be an IPO, so it's an external option. So yes, it is an option. So the agent or broker, they're trying to manage the process and guide the owner through it and work with the leadership team. The trickiest part for them is ensuring it's not rushed. So the more upfront work that can be done, the smoother it goes. The work that you've already done as a COO to get the documentation in order, understand the business, build up the value, and really consider what the value is in the exit is it's highly important. And it really helps them do this. And then the second part is managing the owner's expectations around country club multiples. Oh, I got a 6x, I got a 10x, I got a 12x. And it's really tough at that point. And there's some blowback for you as a COO when they don't see those multiples reflected in what they're hearing from the broker. The truth of the matter is that, well, we can, as selling agents, can try and rationalize and discuss this. When they hear these country club multiples, owners really never understand the full picture. Did the person have to stick around for a year? They're probably not going to tell you that they actually had the most miserable time of their life working for somebody else, even though the multiple was higher because of it. And there's a real balance behind that. But the more you can do to prep your owner, the better. So what's the process? Well, the first part is strategy and planning. So the broker is going to be setting expectations around price and timing. What's the consideration? Cash at close. Is there an earnout? Do you have to provide seller financing? Is there an option for rollover equity where they reinvest in the business? And they're going to be discussing those motivating factors around price, legacy, and also looking at how strong the management team is. The broker will then go and research the company. So they're going to do a comprehensive company analysis, essentially doing due diligence on the organization and evaluation. So they're going to look at the historical and projected financials. So no shoe boxes from the accounting department, please. They're going to be looking at the operations and management, that's structural capital, products and customers, so customer capital. They'll do an industry and market analysis. And then from that, they'll establish valuation criteria, ranges and pricing. So the next thing is they'll prepare materials. So they'll probably have standard non-disclosure agreements. They'll prepare a teaser to determine interest, and then they'll prepare a CIM, a confidential information memorandum, which gives some outline of the details, but not too much. They're looking to do a very proactive positioning, but it needs to be honest, because if stuff comes up later, you can lose a lot of trust with buyers and it will reset the process. The other thing they're going to do is try and anticipate the buyer's questions and talk with you as a COO about, these are my concerns I see coming up. What's your story here? Maybe you need to do some work to answer those questions or at least come up with a plan. And at this point, they're going to come up with a preliminary timeline for the process. And then we're off to market. So we're looking for an IOI, an indication of interest, a conditional non-binding letter of interest. So they're going to have meetings with the management team, the buyers will. And the question is here, what's your role as a COO? So ask yourself, what does the buyer need or should see? How can you explain your differentiators? And let's be honest, how can you impress a potential new owner? Now, there's going to be lots of conversation around customer concentration, market concentration, and dynamics, and you're going to need to explain the SWOT of the business. And the goal of this is to get a letter of intent or LOI. And then from that point, we'll progress to due diligence. So it's the buyer's responsibility to fully understand their risk, but the burden of proof is on the seller. And so everything you've been doing for the last couple of years as a COO to de-risk and build up value within the business and document that is then on the table, and you have your burden of proof. And I would say this, as multiples rise, which is great, the due diligence has become more in-depth and more sophisticated. All right, closing. We've hit the goal line, right? So we're going to be doing the purchase agreement, leasing agreement, maybe consulting agreements, the former owner. Everything's dotted. The question is, how do you guide through it and work with the new ownership? So when we talked about the meetings with the new owners, I would say you really want to try and understand them, try and understand their culture, and see how your organization is going to align with them, or if they're a strategic acquirer, how will your two cultures blend? As you can see, it's a significant amount of work, but the more you can prepare, the less the impact is on the business. And when I said earlier, do you want to be doing this all, under the gun? You probably don't. Okay, so what makes a successful exit? As a SEPA, my job is to make sure that there is maximized transferable value, that the owner understands their options and knows what they are and makes a good selection and gets good advisors, and that they have something exciting for the next chapter of their life, so they don't mess you around. What can you do as a COO? So your role, increase earnings, reduce risk, and position the best in class. So thinking back to your scores around readiness and attractiveness and for the 4 C's, this is your area and this is how you drive value in an exit. Probably not that different from your strategy as COO. So you guys are already expert exit planners. So quick recap of what we talked about. Why would I want to exit? We talked about the 5 Ds: death, disability, divorce, disagreement, and distress. I think the watchword there is be prepared. We talked about the process and what your role is as COO. So remember, we talked about the Exit Planning Institute's 3 gates: the discover, prepare, and decide. We talked about owner readiness, business attractiveness, and the beauty being in the eye of the beholder. And then we looked at our profit gap and value gap and how that affects the final value. And then also the owner's wealth gap. So why are they going where they want to go? We talked about driving value within the business using the 4 types of intangible capital, the 4 C's, so human, structural, social, and customer capital. And then we talked about options for exiting, so internal and external. How do you decide? So thinking about money after tax, control, legacy. And so really, what makes a successful exit? So I'm going to put up the Exit Planning Institute's little diagram, I think that explains everything around it. But to quote them, an exit plan asks and answers all the business, personal, financial, legal, and tax questions involved in transitioning a privately owned business. So thank you for listening. I appreciate your time. I do have some complimentary offers for you guys if you'd like to take them up. If you're a business owner and want to dive in to see how ready you are for an exit, or if you're a COO and want to understand how attractive your business is, contact me. I would love to talk with you. If you just want to chat about exit planning, I'd love to talk more. So thank you. And if you guys have any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Nick, I had a question, and it's mainly related to my question about going public. So we transitioned to an ESOP at the end of 2020, which means we get a formal valuation every year.
Yep.
And our multiple is somewhere in the range of a 5. It changes every year based on external factors and what they're seeing for mergers and acquisitions, I guess. But when they compare us to other firms, some of our competitors are public, and their multiples are somewhere in the range of like 12, right? So in theory, if you go from private to public, your multiple could go from 5 to 12. Am I understanding that right?
I'll be honest, I don't know, but I can give you some suggestions as to why that might happen. ESOPs are generally well run because there's a high level of motivation within the organization to do well because you're profit sharing. They've already been pre-vetted by the bank. So when you go through the ESOP process, Basically, you're asking the bank to fund the owner's exit based on the performance of the business. There's as you know, in this, Mike, there's probably like about 10 steps, right, in forming an ESOP. And they're also highly regulated, so there's a lot of insight. So when you put that kind of business on a public market, there's less risk there. And I know there are PE firms and others doing roll-ups of ESOPs. So then it comes down to demand. Why not buy a business where you have very accurate insight into what's going on and also highly motivated employees? But I don't know the official reason. But that's my guess.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Anybody else? Any questions? Anything I didn't explain well or you have questions about? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk with you guys. So hopefully it's been informative. As I said, if you ever have any questions, please give me a shout. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.